Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Classical Antiquity Sidequest, a podcast covering topics from classical antiquity. The period of time is known for, as Edgar Allan Poe put it, the glory that was Greece, the grandeur that was Rome. Our next side quest is going to take us to the topic of late antiquity. Specifically, we're going to learn what that term means, and also what happened during this period of time, and learn that it's sort of in flux, it's evolving. The boundaries of it are not yet determined and not yet fully formed and are subject to an ongoing reevaluation. Our guide for this next side quest is Dr. Jeremy Swist. He is a professor of classics at Grand Valley State University. He has a very interesting background, and he is going to use his particular area of expertise to enlighten us and inform us and hopefully educate us about what to me is becoming a very fascinating topic that's a little outside of what I had intended to cover with this podcast. It turns out late antiquity is a period of great change, a period of great upheaval, and a period of reformation to some extent. Terms may be a little misleading and maybe a little loaded value judgment wise, but you'll see what I mean as we discuss it. There's some new players who come on the scene in the Roman Empire during this time period. There's some new societal tribal groups that come on the scene, and there's some new religious practices that start to appear. And we start to see this historical contextualization of the division between East and West as far as the empire. It starts to play out. Now, that's a whole lot to cover, and it's a whole lot to talk about. But as you all know, this podcast is a podcast without end. So maybe we'll learn more about late antiquity during some future episodes. I sure hope that we do, because Dr. Swist has a lot of interesting things to talk about, including the relationship between metal music and antiquity, and maybe we should cover that in another date. But this period is very interesting, and I hope you enjoy learning more about it, as I have enjoyed learning more about it, and we will do that now. Dr. Jeremy Swist, how are you, sir?
I am good. How are you?
I'm doing fine. I'm doing fine. Thank you for being available on this lovely Labor Day and delaying my grass cutting by a little bit, which we will get to when this is finished. But thank you for coming on. If you wouldn't mind, what I like to do with first-time guests is give them a chance to tell the audience their origin story. How did they get involved in late antiquity? Or, well, we'll talk about late antiquity, but how did you become a student of the classics and end up in your current research field?
Well, that's always a question that can get very personal. But I think for me, one of the first things was, I grew up in the Catholic Church, going to Catholic church every day, and I was at a Catholic church in Harvard Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where half the mass was sung in Latin every day. And so from an early age, I was kind of being exposed to this interesting language that I associated with this church, which was a very Romanesque church, St. Paul Church in Cambridge, that had, all the kind of classicizing statuary and stained glass and relief sculptures. And it was this really cool space, and they had a really nice music program. And so I associated Latin with all of these other uh, with this really cool space that was by design, at a remove from kind of the mundane world, which was kind of the function of that kind of space. And so I also associated Latin with that kind of aesthetic that I was sort of drawn to. And then as later on, I was starting to play computer games like Age of Empires, which was sort of my first introduction to the history of, the Greece and Rome and Egypt and everything. And so that became sort of a hobby interest. And as I went through school, I found that I was doing better and was just more engaged in my history, social studies, geography classes. And then eventually, once I got to high school, I signed up for Latin as a language course. And from there, I basically got hooked. By the time I got to college, I wanted to be a Latin teacher and just a teacher in general. And then I started reading ancient philosophy and got more into ancient history through the people who mentored me at at college, the University of Maine. In particular, one of my mentors was the Roman historian Jay Bregman, who specializes in late antiquity, in the Roman Emperor Julian, in the philosopher Bishop Dionysius of Cyrene, and also late antique Judaism as well. And so here was an expert who first introduced me to the topic of late antiquity as I was already kind of committing myself to being a classicist and ancient historian at this point. And so when I ended up developing a research program, it was highly influenced by Jay Bregman, and now I'm going to be putting out a book on the Emperor Julian of my own as a result of that.
That's Julian is a fascinating figure, especially for a guy with such a short reign, but he's so well remembered. I want to follow up on some of the ancient philosophy that you talked about because uh, I'm an attorney and we have to do these legal wellness, continuing legal education things to keep our license. And they want to make sure the state bar wants to make sure that we're not sad because of our work and that we're okay. And I was sitting through some of these and they're really kind of mind numbing and not helpful. But as they were talking about it, I said, I mean, guys, we could just do presentations on like Stoic philosophy and talk about, Seneca's writings and things like that that would actually be interesting. And I'm just curious kind of what specific philosophy you were reading or what schools of philosophy you were reading when you were getting more interested in becoming a classicist.
Mhm. So at the University of Maine, where I went to college, I was in the honors program where we had, 4 semesters where it was basically a great book sequence, where we were reading, famous works of literature, philosophy, and science, and art as well from certainly a lot of the Western canon, but we were also looking at stuff from the Far East and the New World, etc. And when we came to ancient Greek philosophy, the things that were most highly influential on me were the pre-Socratic philosophers, as well as the writings of Plato as well. And I really like the pre-Socratic philosophers because they were asking uh, a lot of questions that are now answered by modern science. But because things like science and philosophy and ethics and logic and all these things, which are considered separate disciplines or sub-disciplines today, back then it was all just one thing and they didn't separate them apart. And so we had the first philosophers in Greece, were kind of looking at the universe, in terms of how questions of physics and questions of ethics, there's a continuity there, right? And it's also related to mythology and religion in many ways, and they're writing it in poetry. They're using poetry to express these ideas, right? And so we have people like Anaximander talking about how the universe achieves a balance, and that's called justice, right? And then we have Empedocles coming along, talking about the balance of love and strife in the universe, right? And the 4 elements, how they harmonize, and they are also identified with various uh, figures from mythology, right? And so it's a really cool way to see how um, different aspects of things that I consider cool to talk about in antiquity were seen as relating to each other, whereas these are things that are seen as sort of separated apart today and don't have much to do with each other. And so that's what I like about early Greek philosophy is it doesn't throw out mythology or religion, right? But it uses those terms and looks at it in a more rational way. Um, to produce some very interesting ways of looking at the world.
Yeah, that concept of balance, or I guess maybe water finding its level, whatever terminology you want to
Mhm.
use, I've been kind of in my mind playing with it as I'm kind of writing an outline if I ever get a chance to do a CLE on Stoicism and the practice of
Mhm.
law. I kind of think of it as sort of like a predictive pattern and things fall into patterns, and there's things that you just should expect to happen. Like, for example, as an attorney, I don't do these cases anymore, but if you do domestic work, it's going to be sad. You're going to be
Hmm.
upset. Parents are going to use kids as proxy battles, whatever. And you just kind of have to understand, okay, this is the way things are, and bring your, not make that part of your own life. But it's something we could delve off into a great deal more. I've got a couple of books up on my shelf that I need to make my way through before I can kind of finalize this bare bones outline that I've been slowly putting together. But I want to ask you a little bit about late antiquity. We've used that term a couple of times. The podcast is called Classical Antiquity, so obviously there's a change to some extent between those time periods. Could you start by telling us what late antiquity is and the time period that it encompasses?
Well, the great thing about late antiquity is, and for us, people like me who study it, is we like the fact that the term itself already kind of causes some disorientation and upsets a lot of kind of popular and traditionally held notions about how we kind of divide up history into neat little periods, right? Where each period has these essential characteristics. So, starting in the Renaissance, when people were trying to kind of bring back, the aesthetics and the thought and sort of the culture of what they called classical antiquity of Greece and Rome, um, that caused them to look at the past 1,000 years up until that point as a period of decline and sort of backwardness and a loss of and a departure from all of those ideals that they were trying to give rebirth to in this Renaissance, right? And so as a result, the legacy of that in the popular imagination and how a lot of people have looked at history is that for European history specifically, and again, this whole model I'm talking about presupposes kind of a Eurocentric orientation here. History can be divided into antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the modern period, right? And so antiquity ends when the Roman Empire ends, right? Or the Western Roman Empire ends in the late 400s CE. And then 1,000 years later, right, when the Renaissance happens, okay, then we are at the end of the Middle Ages, right? And then modernity begins. And then we have we basically come full circle to a flourishing civilization, quote unquote, and now we can progress and advance that even further to the whatever we have today, however you want to look at it. And what late antiquity does is says, well, wait a minute, history is a lot messier than that. Periodization, dividing up history into these little neat little boxes is arbitrary. And of course, people at the time weren't aware that they were in any particular era of history because they didn't really have the historical sense that we have now. And so what late antiquity does is says, well, no, there's a period, if we want to create a period of transition, let's say, between what we might call the classical world and the medieval world. And this transition takes centuries and it happens at different rates and in different ways in different parts of the world. Um, and so where it begins and where it ends will vary. So generally, late antiquity, when we talk about it, we're mainly talking about the world centered around the ancient Mediterranean traditionally. Lately, more people have expanded the boundaries of what late antiquity affects to, all of Europe and a good part of North Africa and Eurasia. And some people are even going beyond that and saying and talking about a global late antiquity as well. That we're not, these are arbitrary boundaries that we're placing geographically in which we have this kind of period affecting. But traditionally, especially in the last, say, half century since the work of scholars like Peter Brown, who brought kind of the idea of late antiquity more into the general awareness of scholars, is that late antiquity begins somewhere in the third century CE. A a lot of people call that around the crisis of the third century when the Roman Empire is going through several acute political and economic and social crises, and emerges from those toward the end of the third century uh, with new kinds of cultural, political, economic reorganization that uh, you can say is more characteristic of late antique society. And when late antiquity ends, so we start in the third century, the 200 CE, where it ends, a lot of people traditionally mark that boundary around, say, the sixth or seventh century, right? Um, and a lot of people will say it's somewhere around 700 or 750 because by that point, we have the rise of Islam from Arabia that had taken over the Sasanian Persian Empire, which was the kind of the empire based around Iran and Iraq during the period of late antiquity. And it had also taken over large chunks of the former Roman Empire as well in places like Egypt and North Africa and the Levant. Um, and as a result, the world becomes very different. However, again, uh, especially people who study Islam and Middle Eastern history from that period would argue that Islam itself and the culture of the early Islamic states, like the Umayyad Caliphate and the Abbasid Caliphate, are themselves products of late antiquity and shouldn't be seen as categorically different than things like the Roman Byzantine Empire, Sasanian Empire, that it comes to supersede, right? So you can see here that that late antiquity is a concept that is evolving, um, and where you draw the line can be entirely arbitrary, and can be problematic as well. Um, and that's fine. Generally, for most people, it's not like I study the Roman Empire in the fourth century, right? So kind of the period that most people agree is late antiquity. So I don't usually have to wrestle with the problem too much, but I should acknowledge that we are continuing to revise the definition of late antiquity in order to include more perspectives from those on the traditional who study or who are identify with traditionally the boundaries of those definitions, because I think that creates a much richer picture of looking at this really rich, fascinating period of history.
How long have we viewed, or how long have historians viewed late antiquity as its own distinct time period for? When did
Mhm.
this kind of reimagination or revision of that era begin, such that we said, okay, now we have a time period that we're going to call late antiquity?
Mhm. Well, um, for centuries, since Edward Gibbon and before, there's always been an acknowledgement that there was a period of at least a few centuries toward the end of the, the empire of the Romans, that was seen as different than what had come before. And this was seen more as the a period of decline, right? Um, Edward Gibbon in 1776, and after that, as he's publishing the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, is kind of calling attention to this period itself, which is defined by, the uh, political and religious and intellectual and social and economic disintegration, stagnation, and sort of deterioration of classical civilization identified with the Roman Empire and its culture, which is funny because, the entire all the 6 volumes of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire actually goes to 1450, all the way to the end of the Byzantine Empire, and he would just consider the Byzantine Empire just a millennium long period of this decline, which is funny that, you know, and so
It's a slow burn.
a slow burn, essentially. Yeah, right. And again, a lot of this is predicated on value judgments, right? The word classical in classical antiquity implies a value judgment that, uh, you know, what the Greeks were doing in the 5th and 4th century BCE, or what the Romans were doing in the 1st century BCE, CE, right, was considered the pinnacle of civilization, culture, in terms of aesthetics, intellectual achievements, etc. Right. And those are value judgments that have since, in many respects, in among scholars, not all of them, have resisted. The word classics itself and classical is slowly being phased out by many, though there's certainly plenty who maintain it and still subscribe to this idea, right? And
As we
so,
should, because I don't want to change the name of the podcast.
right,
That would cause problems, people. You
right,
can't do that to me.
right. And when people use the word classical, right, it can still have that neutral sense of, we are referring to a specific time period and place within history, right? And it's not to suggest that the person is knowingly, right, using the value judgments that that term can otherwise uh use. So you're fine, right?
Good, good, good.
Anyway,
Because I'm not redoing this. I mean, I
no,
can't. I just
no,
too much has been invested.
right. I mean, my degree is in classics, right? That's what it
Right.
says on my diploma, so I'm not exactly going to throw that out. Okay. Anyway, what kind of the reevaluation of late antiquity does is it looks at this period that is traditionally looked at as, the low empire as opposed to the high empire. Like, one of the French terms for this period that is popular is le bas empire, the empire down to the base, right? The low empire, right? And it's now saying that no, this is a period that is just as interesting, that is culturally vibrant. Um, but what's going on here is we have, a bunch of significant changes happening, that make this period different than what came before. However, what's happening is there's still a lot of continuity from the classical antiquity that is interacting with some of these new paradigms that are coming in and creating, something that is, I think, quite interesting, right? So, for instance, this is when we have, the rise of Christianity, not just to social and cultural, but also political prominence. And as a result, it is, um, being blended with, kind of the higher culture to create, new types of literature, right? And it is also engaging with some of the intellectual culture, it is taking on Greek philosophy, and it's also being integrated into, the politics of the Roman Empire and as well as other, kind of political entities of the time, right, such as, Ethiopia, Aksum, Armenia, and eventually various, states of the so-called barbarians, the Germanics, peoples coming in who are going to also adopt Christianity, forms of it. And of course, Christianity is also going to filter its way even further east with like Nestorian Christianity, right? And it's not just Christianity, of course. Judaism is still very much present. It is developing in as rabbinic Judaism, and taking part in a lot of this. And there's also, of course, the persistence and developments of non-Christians and non-Jewish people, that we can group into generally as pagans, though of course that is a term that is just a monolith that doesn't that isn't a monolith. There's a lot of diversity within that, but I think we'll be talking about that soon.
Well, it sounds like for those of you who listen to both of my podcasts, you'll know that I use a term. People talk about college conferences, they call it realignment. I call it restructuring because that's
Hmm.
more in line with kind of a bankruptcy type thing where something new's coming out of it. But the way
Hmm.
you've described late antiquity, and we mentioned this before we started talking, I've been listening to some episodes of Byzantium and Friends. In particular, I think it was episode 43 about a discussion of the term Byzantine and whether that should still be used.
Hmm.
And it just seems like this whole period is a period of reorganization and restructuring.
Hmm.
The prior kind of government religious ties that bound everything together are being replaced, pushed aside, reformed to some extent.
Hmm.
And we're seeing something new come out of it, but it's not the cesspool, maybe, or dregs that some historians had viewed it as for a long time. Is that fair?
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think because, history has traditionally been viewed kind of with a bias toward political history. So people kind of with the retrospective knowing that, say, the Western Roman Empire will, you know, collapse in the fifth century, will therefore look at kind of the couple centuries that precede that event, if you can really call it an event, a series of changes, really. And kind of identify them as leading to that inevitable result. And the other thing is, Gibbon and a lot of this thought is coming out of the Enlightenment, and also, also from various Protestant perspectives, and anti-Catholic perspectives, where they are very much going to identify the rise of Christianity and the power of the Catholic Church as a factor in this decline, and the ultimate destruction of Rome. And so uh, those are views that are, have that are now being phased out as we are seeing that, issues like why did the Roman Empire collapse are much more complex. And I think religion is the role that that plays in this political, process, is can sometimes be overstated, right? And so we have to separate out some of the religious questions, from this, even though a lot of the literature and some of the loudest voices in the conversation, especially in our sources, have a religious hinge to it. Um, we shouldn't, read them as literally.
And so you've touched on this a little bit with the religious changes of this time period,
Hmm.
but it sounds like part of what's going on in the late antiquity time period is the decline of, just to make it easy to understand the terminology, old
Hmm.
paganism, the old state-sponsored gods, and the rise of Christianity and Islamic empires.
Hmm.
Is that kind of the broad strokes, or are there other religious changes going on in that time
Hmm.
period?
So when we talk about kind of the decline of what we might call paganism, of course, the idea of paganism itself is that paganism is a term. Pagan is a term that was essentially um, used by Christianity at the time in order to identify non-Christians and non-Jews, and to sort of stigmatize them and marginalize them as a group. Whereas, in fact, uh, the way we use the term now, as we sort of revise this term, we use it as a kind of a catch-all term for the diversity of um, belief in various gods and cults, and mystery religions, that existed throughout the ancient Mediterranean and beyond during that time, that cannot be identified closely with Christianity or Judaism, right? And so when we talk about the decline of paganism, what we're talking about is, for one thing, we're talking about uh, a de-investment in some of the more public and civic oriented and state oriented manifestations of pagan worship identified with various cities throughout the empire as well as the Roman state. Okay, so for instance, in the second century, during the so-called High Empire, this is where we have a lot of local elites making a lot of public investment in temples, in civic cults, in kind of the traditional gods of, say, ancient Greece, right? Because this was a time during sort of a renaissance of called the second sophistic of Greek culture, right? And after the third century crisis and with the rise of Christianity and various other forms of social and political organization, we start to see that there is much less of this investment in the upkeep and building of temples and the funding of civic festivals, which used to be normal. Part of this is because um, with sort of the economic crisis in the third century, there is more of a need for investment in defense and infrastructure rather than things like these more culturally oriented institutions, right? During the third century, we had uh, political collapses that led to various invasions by various groups. So, for instance, there was an invasion of the Heruli, a tribe that went down and sacked Athens, right? And so the recovery from that took a long time. Um, and also with the rise of Christianity, of course, now and the conversion of Constantine in the Emperor Constantine in 312 to Christianity, we are now seeing the Roman state de-investing in the upkeep of traditional state cults. And throughout the fourth century, it kind of with the exception of the reign of the Emperor Julian, who tries to bring this all back, largely the Roman state cults, in terms of sort of how the empire is allocating resources, is largely being maintained by the the pagan Roman senators in the city of Rome itself, such as Symmachus, right, who are maintaining some of these traditional priesthoods. Now, this is for like civic and state cults. Uh, However, um, there was still, throughout this time, a lot of other forms of what we might call pagan belief in various strata of society, right? There were people in the countryside who kind of had their traditional beliefs that largely were unaffected. And then there was also kind of people who were more educated, as well as people who were kind of more socially mobile and who were joining these various mystery cults, right? The cult of Mithras, for instance, was very popular in various places. And uh, and then there were people who were, among the more educated classes who were highly influenced by Greek philosophy, who were, as a result of Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, the Chaldean oracles, and various other of these intellectual movements, were engaging in sort of a synthesis of traditional uh, Greek and Roman religion with classical philosophy, okay, which would culminate in, say, the Neoplatonism of thinkers like Iamblichus, who was influential on the Emperor Julian himself. Okay, so that's paganism. And then Christianity itself, like paganism, is also not a monolith at this time or before it. Okay, before Constantine comes along, Christianity, was developing in various, especially in cities of the empire, but also, elsewhere. And as a result of different churches and different Christian communities developing in relative isolation across this large empire and beyond, okay, because Christianity was being spread beyond the empire at this point as well. Um, these different communities are going to develop different traditions, and they're going to have different kind of forms of dogma and belief. And that's going to include sort of their take on questions about the relative divinity of Christ in relation to God, and things like the efficacy of the veneration of saints and everything like that, and also sort of when do we celebrate Easter, and when was Christmas and everything. And as a result, when the Emperor Constantine converts and then starts to privilege Christianity on its way toward becoming the preeminent religion in the Roman Empire, so such that by the end of the fourth century, it is the de facto state religion under Emperor Theodosius, um, we still have that diversity of amongst Christians. Um, and these different communities. And now that we have the state involved, there is a political uh, wish among Constantine and his imperial successors to achieve some sort of unity amongst these various Christian communities, so that Christianity can be this one thing with this one doctrine, right? And one set of beliefs that everybody follows, right? In order to be called a proper Catholic Christian, right? Catholic just means universal, right? We are the universal faith. We are the universal chosen people, right? And we believe this one thing, especially things pertaining to our salvation and our Savior, right? And as a result, uh, the history of the ecclesiastical history, of the religious history of late antiquity is often characterized by conflicts between various bishops and Christian groups over doctrine and the intervention of the imperial state in order to achieve and to work out these disputes. And so the most famous one was the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE that was convened by the Emperor Constantine, his first kind of the first major imperial effort to hammer out a single creed and achieve this kind of unity. And kind of the main issue at the Council of Nicaea was to try to figure out, okay, what is the relationship of Christ to God the Father? Are they of the same substance? Is Christ subordinate and a creation of the Father, which would be what's called Arianism from Bishop Arius, or is it more there is equality between the three persons of the Holy Trinity, Christ, the Father, and the Holy Spirit, which is still the Catholic and Orthodox position, right? And then throughout and into the fifth century and beyond, we have other controversies and church councils that hammer out other sorts of issues, such as does Christ have two natures or a single nature, which is something that is relevant at, say, the Council of Chalcedon in 451, and that causes a major split between those who believe in the single nature, the Monophysites, and those who believe in the dual nature, the Chalcedonian position, which again is the Orthodox position. Um, and so these this diversity of belief, pertains to sort of official doctrine also. Then you're talking about individuals. Individual Christians during late antiquity, people who we might identify as Christians, are also on a spectrum of belief where some are closer to what we might call pagans, whereas some are closer to what we might call believers in Judaism, right? And so, when we talk about late antique Christianity, we're not talking about by any stretch a single thing, right? And that's representative, I think, of kind of uh, the diversity of that we see in late antiquity in general.
So while these changes are going on, there's also, to some extent, divisions between East and West of the
Hmm.
empire. And I want to come back to that. But you touched on this briefly with the Germanic tribe that sacked Athens. The various German tribes become much larger players.
Hmm.
during this time period. But what are some of the other ethnic groups that become significant? Uh, I don't know if contributors is the right word, sticking with because what Florida State's going to play Boston College tonight, so I'll probably watch some of that. But so who's going to play is stuck in my mind. My law partner's an FSU alum, but who are the other important ethnic groups that become significant historically during the time period of late antiquity?
So I think the first thing I'd like to address is, when we use the term kind of ethnic groups, and since we're talking about, the Germanic tribes, as you say, that leads to one of sort of the problems when we approach this question when we're talking about late antiquity is, how do we identify different individual ethnic groups among the uh, Germanic and Hunnic and Slavic and various other um, quote unquote barbarian tribes or peoples that are already long established in Northern Europe and as well as migrating into Western Europe from further east, right? Because our sources are either written in Greek and Latin by people within the Roman Empire who are looking at these groups, you know, from an outsider's perspective. And so we have to be skeptical about what they're saying. And then we also have archaeological sources that are ambiguous from what's on the ground here, partly because there is also a lot of Roman influence as well, because a lot of these peoples who are coming into Europe are doing is they are Romanizing, right? They are being highly influenced by the Romans and Roman and Greek culture, and they are not coming in there they're not coming in there to destroy it, right? They're coming to be a part of it, right? And so when we talk about, say, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, what we're really talking about is these various peoples who are trying to carry on its legacy in various ways, and that are, and the difference is to what degree are they being officially recognized as Roman? Okay. But in terms of other players within the late antique world, whether within the confines of the Roman Empire or beyond, um, certainly the Roman Empire had always uh, consisted of a wide diversity of ethnic groups. And so when we call what we call the Romans, right, is a political identity. Everybody since 212 with the Edict of Caracalla living within the Roman Empire who is free, right, is a Roman citizen, right? Regardless of what their ethnicity is or their primary language, right? So Greek and Latin, these are official languages of law and the military and education and economics and administration, right, that are spoken in the western and eastern half of the empire, respectively, though there's a lot of mixing. There's still lots of local languages being spoken in North Africa. There's Punic. In Egypt, there's what we call Coptic. And in Syria, there's Syriac, and then there's Armenian. And um, so we have a lot of people in late antiquity who are maybe writing in Latin or writing in Greek, but that's not their first language, right? They're not thinking in those languages, but they're using Greek and Latin to communicate and participate in the wider culture in some way. That said, what we also see in late antiquity is the development of uh, literatures in other languages, especially uh, literatures that are articulating Christian ideas. And so, for instance, we have the rise of Syriac literature, uh, as well as Coptic literature in Egypt, and further south from that, we have Ethiopic literature in places like Aksum in Ethiopia. We have Armenian and Georgian, right, over in the Armenia and the Caucasus. We have Persian literature in Persia, and eventually we will have Islamic Arabic literature, right, in those places as well. Okay, and so So what's cool about late antiquity is because we have these other literary traditions that are being written in these languages that have always been spoken in these areas. Um, it's a rare bird who is a scholar who is an expert in all of these languages. There's a few people out there who can do quite a few, right? And I went and some of my grad school professors, they knew like four or five of these. But what's cool about late antiquity is because we have all of these different language literature traditions, it really invites us to collaborate uh, with each other rather than kind of become solitary experts. Um, and therefore, late antiquity challenges a lot of kind of the categories of what it means to be a scholar of antiquity or a scholar of the Middle Ages, where, we're learning Latin and ancient Greek. Or Byzantine Greek if you're a Byzantinist, right? And those are sort of the main languages of the historical sources and the literatures you're studying. And you're saying, well, no, there is other evidence and literatures that we can learn from, right, that are engaging with the same with what's going on, right, religiously, politically, socially at the time that we need to learn from. Okay. And I think that's an invitation that I think is exciting, right? It's also humbling, but I think well, plenty of people could use that kind of humility.
So you mentioned this Byzantinists. I want to talk about that a little bit here
Mhm.
because one of my most recent annoyances is the term Byzantine Empire itself. It
Mhm.
bothers me to no end, but nonetheless, it's there. I feel like I was lied to as a student, um, and I'm bitter about that now for some reason. I guess I have to be angry about something. But my son is taking AP World History this year, and I asked him one day, "What are you learning about?" He said, "Well, we just learned about the Byzantine Empire." And then he started to go to something else. And I said, "Stop, stop, stop. There was no such empire." He said, "No, no, no." I said, "No, no, no, no. It's a complete misnomer. Not a thing. Not a real term." I said, "I've done a podcast episode where we discussed this briefly. Clearly, you're not listening, so I'll send you the link." But I've also listened to some other podcast episodes discussing the terminology of it, and I just am curious if the somewhat I didn't realize how loaded of a term Byzantine is and all the stuff that's behind it, but that's fascinating to learn about. But is late antiquity where we start to see this kind of historical division that exists between the East and West Empire, and where
Mhm.
we start creating this rubric of this separate zombie empire that somehow survived for about 1,000 years?
So, yes, I definitely understand the controversy over the term Byzantine, and because yes, it is, a modern label, developed in the past few centuries in order to distinguish, right, the Eastern Roman Empire as it existed from late antiquity to its fall in 1453 from what otherwise people associate, definitionally with the Roman Empire that preceded it, anywhere. Well, the thing is, late antiquity is also a modern category, right? Antiquity is a category, right? And so, when we're talking about how it's a made-up term that's arbitrary, um, you could say that for a lot of things. Um, I think with the term Byzantine itself, there's a more the argument there is more we shouldn't view the Byzantines empire as we might call it as you know categorically different from the Roman Empire that preceded it. And that's
Right.
true, right? There's
Yeah.
so much continuity. And especially since they identified themselves as the Romans all the way through and after, right? To the point where in the 19th century, as during the revolution of that independence of the Greeks, they're going around liberating the different islands from the Ottoman Empire and saying, they're coming into people's homes. They're saying, "Hey, you're free from the Turks now, right? All of us Hellenes are free." And the people on the island are like, "Who are Hellenes? We are Romans," right? And so things like that. But anyway,
Yeah, no, and I think
yeah,
that's where it's frustrating is because
yeah,
the way that it's taught, it presumes that the empire itself referred to it as Byzantine and that it was
yeah,
a specific name for this empire and this group of people, and that's not the case. That creating a term like late antiquity or classical antiquity makes sense because historians are going back and
mhm,
recognizing common eras of historical events, occurrences, and
yeah,
whatever, and you have to make sense of okay, I'm going to
mhm,
try to break down some similarities archaeologically, artistically, religiously, whatever of this time period. That makes sense, but you're not presenting it as and everybody thought of this as antiquity kind of a situation.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
That's where I get frustrated with using the term Byzantine because it seems
yep,
like a historical lie, among other
yeah,
things.
yeah. So when we talk about kind of late antiquity as the time when, you know, what is later identified as the category of Byzantine or Byzantine Empire, take shape. Um, what we're talking about here is a perceived political separation, between the Western Latin speaking half of the Roman Empire and the Eastern Greek speaking half of the Roman Empire. And the joke is that it was divided by a pair of Caesars, right? Uh, and what that's referring to is, the last emperor to rule in his own right both halves of the Roman Empire. The ancient Roman Empire was Theodosius the First, who died in 395 CE, and he was succeeded by his sons Honorius and Arcadius, right? They were both joint emperors. And by this time, the notion of there being more than one emperor was more than a century old, right? It was a practical necessity that was especially kind of normalized under Diocletian, who appointed Maximian as a fellow Augustus, and then they in turn appointed Caesars as kind of designated successors, and then these various co-emperors, right, would rule in various districts of the empire, and as a result, ensure greater stability, so that, if a single emperor on one end of the empire not attending to affairs on the other end of the empire, right, there's going to be problems on the other end of the empire. A usurper might arise, there's civil war and everything, right? And so the idea of appointing multiple emperors was not to divide the empire, right? It was actually to keep the empire together, right? To prevent parts of the empire from breaking away or from usurper emperors from arising, which was a problem that you had in the third century, and it continued to be a problem in the fourth century and fifth century. Certainly, usurpers certainly still arose, and so it didn't fix any of these problems. But again, having multiple emperors did not divide the empire, at least from what they were what their goals with doing that were, right? And for one thing, they were part of the same dynasty, right? They were brothers, Arcadius and Honorius, right? So the idea is that they would continue to maintain these dynastic ties between the two imperial courts, right? And this practice continued into the fifth century, right? So, for instance, you had Theodosius II, right, who succeeded Arcadius, and he betrothed his sister Eudoxia to the Western Emperor Valentinian III, right, in the middle of the fifth century, right? So even while you have two different imperial courts, one based in Constantinople in the east, and one based in Milan, and then later Ravenna, in the west, right? There is still this perception of the unity of the empire, um, from a political perspective, right? What happens um, is that even though there's the perception and the will to see this all as unified, the very fact that you have these two imperial courts kind of establishing themselves in these separate halves of the empire, which are linguistically becoming more distinct and had always been rather distinct anyway between the Latin West and the Greek East, is you are also having around each court uh, a hierarchy of elites and that are administering the empire. So, after the foundation of Constantinople in the fourth century, we start seeing the establishment of its own Senate under the Emperor Constantius II. And then we are starting to see that the elites who are taking part in the administration of the eastern half of the empire, right, are being drawn largely from the eastern half of the empire. And the same thing's happening in the West rather than what we had before, where elites who were traditionally based in Rome would be going off and govern all over the place, right? Which is one way of maintaining that kind of unity, right? Eventually, um, we stop having emperors in the West, right? In the fifth century, we have a series of weak emperors, puppet emperors, who are being controlled by various military strongmen who are, you know, to varying degrees derived from um, what we might call the barbarian peoples, right? Because uh, one major development through the fourth century in Roman late antiquity is we start seeing the Roman army more and more comprised of people of non-Roman extraction. Okay, partly as a result of major losses incurred by the army uh, in some various civil war battles, as well as the Battle of Adrianople against the Goths in 378, where they lose a lot of people. And so we see an increasing reliance on um, military resources that are being controlled by people of barbarian or half barbarian extraction, who are gaining power and influence in the imperial court. Because another important characteristic of the Roman Empire in late antiquity is we have a division now between the civil administration, the governors and everything, the law courts, and the military hierarchy. Okay. Those are under the Roman Empire before that, it was the same. The same people, a provincial governor would be the military leader in that sphere, as well as the administrator and the highest court of appeal. Starting in the late third century, moving forward, now we have two different hierarchies that are complementary. Um, and as a result of that, we start having the emperors in the West um, and the leaders of the army not always being the same person by the fifth century, whereas in the fourth century they were the same person, right? The emperor was sort of where these two hierarchies came together. And at one point, that system just stopped, right? Um, in 476, the last kind of puppet Roman emperor who had no military power was basically just the son of one of these sort of military strongmen was overthrown. And the military strongman that came in said, you know what? We're not going to do this anymore, right? We don't need to have, a Western Roman emperor, okay, ruling in Italy. We already have an emperor in Constantinople. Why can't that just be the emperor? And then I'm just going to rule. Okay, this is a guy named Odoacer. I'll just rule in my own right here in Italy, as a viceroy of the emperor, right? And so this is where we see the uh, that the continuity, uh, where even those who have taken over parts of the Roman Empire in the West and rule it in their own right are still at least giving lip service to the idea that this is a single empire, that there is an emperor, right? But in reality, they really don't owe them any allegiance. They're not paying them any taxes. They're giving them nothing, right?
Right, but there's nothing else there to take it over. So it's like, well, what are we going to be if we're not Roman? So we've got to at least
Yeah.
keep that going to some
Mhm.
extent. But what I find though interesting with kind of the aftermath of the collapse of the two emperors is that kind of local kingship concept stays pretty well entrenched for a while, and
Mhm.
then along comes Justinian on his
Mhm.
campaigns and really causes some problems for Italy at that point.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, because you know, with Justinian's reconquest of several parts of the Western Roman Empire, right? It is precisely because there is this idea that there is a single empire that has always persisted, and that what they're doing is that they're just reasserting their authority over those parts of the empire that they already believed that they were entitled to rule. Okay. Because at that point they recognized that the people who were ruling those parts of the empire uh, were not really uh, part of the Roman state anymore. They were not paying them taxes, they were not paying them soldiers, and they didn't even believe in the same Christian doctrines. So, the Ostrogoths, for instance, who were ruling Italy, and the Vandals that were ruling North Africa after they had taken over these parts, uh, were Arians, right? They did not believe in the creed of the Council of Nicaea, right? And so they were heretics. Okay, and so that was another excuse to reassert this imperial unity, right, by militarily campaigning and reconquering these territories, right, to bring unity to Rome, to the Roman Empire. You know, at least the very at the very least to have the city of Rome, right, be under the direct protection of the Roman Emperor, a which was another reason that they did this, of course, right? So that the popes, right, would be under the protection of the emperor, which would be a great way of ensuring doctrinal unity, okay, but between the Eastern and Western churches too, of course.
So last couple of things here
Mhm.
to close out on. I did not realize this so much because it's not my style of music to listen to. But when I first came across you, I did not realize came across you on Twitter. I did not realize there's a big overlap between metal music and topics from antiquity. But that is
Mhm.
something that is the case, correct?
Oh, certainly, certainly. Metal music in general has always had this sort of reactionary and sort of anti-modern bent to it, right? It's music that appeals to people's sense of rejecting kind of the status quo, and kind of being disillusioned with the modern world, and various institutions of conformity and control and sort of ways of thinking and valuing that are considered mainstream, right? And so topics of the past, especially the pre-modern past, and very much like topics in fantasy, are really appealing places of escape as well as places where you can sort of feel empowered, right? And so you can look at these various topics in history and mythology and kind of really be energized by it, partly just because it is so different and it kind of takes you out of uh, this kind of world today where you feel completely disempowered, and then you can sort of reimagine yourself in somewhere where you can sort of re-achieve some sort of agency or authenticity, right? That you can sort of feel lost today. And of course, that can have some political implications, which is another thing I study. But generally, it's just, a great way for people who are nerdy, kind of people who like to study history for, just sort of as a way to look at the world differently, right? Can do it, but combine it with the music they like. Um, Especially since, traditionally when you study history, a lot of people popularly studying history, especially a lot of men, they look at political and military history, and so they're all about, swords and armor and catapults and trebuchets and, you're going back to playing Age of Empires and stuff like that, like I did when I was a kid, right? And so, and then metal music is about, aggression, right? And extremes, and sort of meditations on, the darkness of the human condition, right? It can also be almost sort of a way of critiquing sort of the worst of humanity. And so, there's a lot there that can be channeled.
So, a couple other things that I wanted to ask you about
Sure.
here. You mentioned, we talked about this before we got started, but reading assignments for us,
Mhm.
homework assignments. Before we get to that, you mentioned you have a book on Julian that you're either working on or is forthcoming. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. So hopefully sometime next year, I'll publish my first book. It's an academic monograph called Julian Augustus, Platonism, Myth, and the Refounding of Rome. And it is largely a look at the writings and the philosophical and political thought of the Roman Emperor Julian, um, how he takes kind of his understanding of Greek philosophy and religion, and how does he apply it to his identity and his program as a Roman emperor, and how does he use literature and myth to articulate that identity and outlook, and that mission of restoring not just the worship of the gods, but restoring the Roman Empire to its former greatness. And so that's kind of the gist of the book. It's coming out with Oxford University Press sometime next year, hopefully.
We'll be looking forward to that. But it's amazing that strain of thought of let's go back to a golden age is so prevalent and it's always been there. I mean, you
Mhm,
can find any sort of well, there can be dangerous politicians who take it and
mhm,
run with it, as we've seen recently, but it's just amazing how powerful of an appeal that kind of a message has. So I'm sure that book will resonate for many reasons.
mhm,
But if you can give us some homework assignments, what are some good books to read, maybe covering late antiquity time period?
mhm, mhm. Okay. So when we are kind of talking about uh, late antiquity as a period of study, uh, one of the classics of scholarship on late antiquity that a lot of people will cite, especially in the English speaking world, is a book called The World of Late Antiquity by Peter Brown. Um, and this was published in 1971, so it's over a half century old. And so there's a lot of it that, shows its age, and that, some ideas have been revised or embroidered, or, some details have been looked at again. However, I think in terms of a lot of its kind of broad ideas of thinking about late antiquity as a distinct period, I think it still holds up. And I think it's a great way it's still a lot, reading it still can be very refreshing for those who are unfamiliar with this period, or they have a lot of kind of traditionally baked assumptions about this period. And I think it's still a great place to start, to give you an idea of different directions of what's going on in this period politically, socially, economically, culturally, etc. Um, Especially religiously. Peter Brown also has, he did a biography of St. Augustine, and is very interested in, uh, religious developments like monasticism and the idea of the holy man, and also sort of points the way toward why we should have more focus attention on Islam and how the development of Islam as a religion and the culture that flourishes under it should be seen as a continuation of late antiquity in many ways. Okay, so that is something I would encourage you to get. Uh, if you are interested in kind of the study of late antiquity from more of a methodological point of view, sort of thinking about the different ways we can approach studying late antiquity, the different types of evidence we look at, the different methods we use, and the different uh, kind of layers that we can apply. Uh, a very useful volume is a companion to late antiquity, as it's called. It's published by Wiley Blackwell. It was edited by Philip Rousseau. Came out in about 2009. And that is a great way to start if you are interested in late antiquity from a scholarly point of view in terms of how it is studied. A Lots of different topics by lots of different current scholars in there, which also kind of consider new directions. I would also encourage you to look at some journals that have arisen in recent times that focus on late antiquity. Um, for a while, there's been the Journal of Late Antiquity, but more recently, there is a journal called Studies in Late Antiquity, which, as its mission, has been trying to kind of expand the ways we look at late antiquity and what we include in late antiquity to have an even more global perspective. Okay, so studies in late antiquity, a lot of good stuff in there. Finally, if you're just looking for um, something that's a bit more of a basic overview to get you started, I would look at Anthony Caldelis's New Roman Empire, which came out with Oxford, I think last year. And this is a book is largely a history of what uh, others may call the Byzantine Empire. However, the overview of the Roman world that constitutes the history of, say, early Byzantium, the early Byzantine Empire, is also a very good way of understanding the, especially the political situation at that time. And you can also see how the legacy of late antiquity continues past maybe the period there we traditionally end late antiquity, and how the legacy of this period is carried on through the history of the later or of the Eastern Roman Empire, which is then bequeathed to the Renaissance and beyond. So those would be some things that I recommend. But there's certainly a lot out there else you can explore.
And on Anthony Caldelis's book, listen to his podcast. We've mentioned it already.
Yeah.
Byzantium and Friends is very good. And there's a
Mhm.
lot of very deep intellectual discussions that can be had
Mhm.
on there if you give it a listen. Uh, Two other things. One, what is a future podcast topic you would like to see covered here? I'm not promising it will happen, but I will try. And then if you could tell us where we can keep up with you on social media.
Mhm. Um, I think a good future podcast topic would be looking at the pre-Socratic philosophers. Um, I think when we when people talk about Greek philosophy and classical Greek philosophy, right? I think Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and maybe the Stoics, Epicureans get a lot of attention, and that's not unwarranted. But I think they would be nowhere, and there is so much very interesting things going on with a lot of the ideas and how those ideas are presented by people like Heraclitus, like Democritus, like Parmenides, Empedocles, and all the way back to Thales and Anaximander. Um, that's just really fun stuff that I think would appeal to a lot of people.
Okay, and where can we find you on the socials?
Okay. So I'm on the website formerly known as Twitter.
Still
Uh,
Twitter, still
yeah,
Twitter.
yeah, at Metal Classicist. And that's also my handle on Blue Sky, if you're on that platform. So those are basically my two main socials where I engage with the public. Um, and you can also find me. I'm Jeremy Swist on academia.edu, where I have a lot of my scholarship available there also, if you want to see kind of the stuff I work on.
Well, Dr. Swiss, thank you so much for stopping by. I really appreciate it. It was great talking to you, and I look forward to continuing to follow you online. And I will definitely be looking for your book that's going to be coming out. And folks, while we're waiting for that book on Julian to drop, stay in touch with the podcast. You can check us out at our website, bullcitycoordinators.com. Check us out on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Antiquity Pod. Most of the rest of the socials at Duke FB Coverage. You can find us anywhere you get your podcasts. And hey, why not give us a call? 540-632-0160. Leave a message. You'll get on the podcast. I haven't gotten any voicemails yet, but I would like to get some. Shoot us an email, bullcitycoordinators@gmail.com. Give us some questions. Again, this should be interactive. I know a lot of people are listening. Just drop us a line. Let us know what you think. Give us some good reviews and give us something to talk about here on the pod. And remember, the Classical Antiquity Side Quest is a podcast without end.